So welcome everyone. It's great to have so many 100 strong members on this call today for our annual State of the Agency discussion, which is it's going to be really informative and get us all caught up on what is happening with SAVE. I want to thank people who are joining us as guests today. We're happy to have you. This group is a network of women philanthropists who come together to inform ourselves about the work of SAVE and other issues that impact children. And it's kind of an inner circle of really strong, smart, dedicated women who, we participate in different events throughout the year, hoping you can join us in these discussions. They're always super fruitful and informative. And we also, some of us participate in 100 Strong Mentoring Program, and which provides support to some of the women leaders across the global SAVE program community. And that you can we'll learn more about that. We'll talk more about that. And if you wanted to reach out directly to Mary to find out what that is, she'll sign you right up. We were founded in 2019, and we number about 50 people now. So the goal is to get to 100 so we can really be 100 strong, right? So on that note, I want to thank our co-founder, Peg McGattrick, who I hope is on this call, for all her contributions as co-chair. She approached me last summer and said it's time to find some new leadership for this group, and she invited me to join Anya and co-chair, and I couldn't be more honored. So hopefully I do this group justice. Our State of the Agency discussion has been an annual 100 strong call with Yanti. It's a look back at the year prior, a look ahead to what we plan to focus on. Of course, with the nature of all these concurrent crises, we don't always know what we're going to focus on. But what we do know is that we exist to serve children. And it's great to be part of this inner circle of 100 strong because it's really a privilege to hear these thoughts directly from Yanti, our fearless leader. Speaking of fearless, Yanti has just returned from a trip to Israel and the West Bank, Egypt, and the Gaza border. So she's going to talk a lot about this event. In fact, she literally just returned and has jet lag. So it's going to be fascinating to hear her perceptions of what's happening there now. Also delighted to have Sylvia Parazzolo, who leads our Evidence for Impact at Save the Children. Hi, Sylvia. So Evidence for Impact is super important because what it does is it enables us to evaluate our programs and, to demonstrate our outcomes to our donors to show that we're making the greatest impact for children. And showing that we are making a real difference. And we do such a great job of it. And this is why we have such recurring donors funding grants year after year. So we invite you to ask questions at any point. It's sort of more interesting and free-flowing that way. And that way we know that you're, participating and listening. And I guess just with that, I just want to thank Yanti and Sylvia for joining us, and take it away, Yanti.
Thank you, Corinne, and great to see everybody again here. Such an amazing group of supporters for us, and partners, really partners, not in crime, but in partners in good trouble, to help us and ask us questions, and just be engaged in the way that you are. It matters a lot, and just to sort of plug Corinne's plug for the mentorship. I get to meet some of the staff that are mentored by some of you, and I cannot tell you enough how much that matters to them to be seen by people like yourself, as well as getting the advice and the access. So I'll talk a little bit about 2023, our look ahead for 2024, and I'm also happy to share some reflections from the Gaza border. And yes, as Corinne said, forgive me for sometimes my ramble, because I am indeed jet lagged because I landed yesterday back on US soil. So maybe 2023, I think it was indeed I would say a dreadful year for children. I don't think we can sugarcoat it in any shape or form. It was also another, I said to Brad a couple of weeks ago, I'm going to stop saying that this year is volatile, uncertain, and VUCA in any shape or form, because every year we thought we had sort of a plan and something happened that sort of upset the plan. And that is, of course, what we know. It is not about having the plan, it's about being engaged in planning. And again, also this year, many unforeseen things from a Sudan, essentially, reappearance of a civil war, to the conflict between Israel and Gaza. So none of these things, I would say, were actually even in our outlook as a risk. And that's why I also started the year really by saying, what children need first and foremost is peace, not to sound like a Pollyanna-ish idealist, but because we know it is hard work, it's development work to get to peace. You need children and women to build peace. And that is the only way ultimately to sustainable economic development and well-being for people anywhere. We're looking at almost 500 million children living in places where there is conflict. That is twice the number of kids living in conflict zones since 1990. So yes, a lot of things have gotten better since 1990. This number got worse, a lot worse. I do think, people always ask me, what gives you hope in a situation like this? And I was asked the question a lot, especially over the last sort of 2 months. And I tend to say that I think our actions inspire hope. It's not the hope that inspires actions, it's the other way around. I've seen us work in all these places where there is conflict and strife, and in almost all of those places we have been for many, many decades. And we are there now. And we also know that we're going to stay afterwards. And nowhere, I think, to me, was that more clear than when I went to Ukraine last year, together with Peg and Deborah and Anne Gates, and looking at, yes, we were there, not for, well, a decade exactly, actually, from now, 2014, we scaled up to do a real, very basic emergency response. I saw this humongous water tower being erected in the south of Ukraine to really deal with the absence of clean drinking water. We're handing out food. We're doing a lot of cash programs for people who were displaced. But we are now also shifting to talk to the Ukrainian government about how to transform their child protection system. We all knew that there were many, many kids in institutions before the war. We also knew that that wasn't a great place for children to be. And now the Ukrainian government has said that they want support to help transform that. Now, that is not a quick fix at all. We've done this in many places and it takes years. But the fact that we're in there, yes, we do basic emergency response, but we are also there for the long term to do this hard yards work of policy and advocacy and political cleverness to make sure that children are protected better in Ukraine long after this war has hopefully ended. So that's, that is sort of an example of, yes, there is conflict. Yes, we have to be there with life-saving interventions, but we're also doing this long-term work. And I think that is where SAVE really excels and it sets us apart from others. A couple of highlights, because yes, it was a tough year for kids. I think we've had a strong year and many things to celebrate. I'm literally coming out of a discussion with the senior team in the US where we're doing those reflections and we're looking ahead. I would also say something about, talking a lot about conflict, but our work in the US in particular, has had an incredible year, I would say, a record year for our Head Start portfolio. Funding for the first time, proper funding for the first time in the state of Texas. And Jen Garner, if you're still in your dentist chair, thank you so much, because you were a large reason as to why that came about. Funding in New Mexico, Catherine Oppenheimer, looking at you. So to be able to expand our work in New Mexico, in Texas, in really, really remote rural communities is unbelievable. And it was a long time coming. We had that desire for years. And sometimes you can't always predict when it's happening, but when it happens, it's a phenomenal thing. Our SCAN, Save the Children Action Network, our SCAN work last year resulted in more than $900 million of more funding in 8 states into early education and childcare. $900 million. I mean, Save the Children's revenues are between $900 million and $1 billion, right? So that came because SCAN advocates sent over 1 million messages to lawmakers and members of Congress. So if you are somebody in Congress, and you get, let's say your office gets 500 messages from your constituents clamoring for childcare, early education investments, that is when you're going to pick up the phone and go like, oh, actually, I need to listen to these guys, right? So that grassroots work with our advocates, and to have them this passionate and engaged and energized is, I think, such an important part of our work. And, you know, SCAN will celebrate its 10th year anniversary this year. We are going to use it to look back, to celebrate achievements, but also to really think about how can we use this amazing asset that it is to do even more. Globally, our Global Humanitarian Fund reached over $100 million. There is no other agencies outside of the UN that has this level of humanitarian funding available for when crises happen. And we've seen that very recently in Gaza, but we also have seen it when the earthquake happened in Turkey, when there is a civil war exploding in Sudan, where we can instantly catapult in not only people, but also money to actually buy stuff, do things immediately before the fundraising machine gets motoring. And then, of course, once we get motoring on fundraising, we're pretty adept at it as well. So those are some of the, and then maybe lastly, maybe 2 things further to mention in terms of 23. The first Green Climate Fund Award led by the US, the 3rd one for Save the Children globally, the 1st one for the US. In Laos, the first climate change award that includes health, our health work, as well as the impact of climate change on health for children. And we're incredibly excited about that. It took us 3 years to get to this place. So some of these things are long fought, but it's fantastic that the work can now start. And then maybe also for this group, our early child marriage efforts that this group has been so invested in, literally invested in, but also so passionate about. And, you know, Corinne and you and I and Deborah went there and saw the work in Kalaun with the paramount chiefs, passionately talking about why they wanted their girls in their communities to not get married before the age of 18. You know, astonishing, right, to see that impact so relatively quickly of not just one community, but we had 15 paramount chiefs now saying, oh, no, we're going to do this work with girls and their parents and the fathers and the brothers in our communities. And I think we're very close to actually landing national level impact there. In Sierra Leone, one of the countries where, you know, early child marriage is one of the most prevalent issues for girls in particular. So we are incredibly thankful for this group for pushing that with us and also helping it set up and are now hoping for real replication. Then quickly about 2024, I'm sure you're reading all of your, you know, the year is still young, but it feels like, you know, we've been in it already for a couple of months, or at least I feel that keenly. It is the largest election year in history, not just here, but in many, many countries. And that, of course, creates opportunities and also, you know, significant risk. Humanitarian funding, aid budgets are under pressure, not only in the United States, but everywhere. Civil space is under pressure. Save the Children is at risk of essentially losing our presence in India because of Indian local regulations and essentially a shrinking of organizations who want to speak out and want to do work on issues for kids that sometimes governments don't really want to acknowledge exist. We'll have over 300 million people in need, one of the largest numbers certainly in recent history. Now, the silver lining about all those things is that it will force Save the Children and many, many others to also confront some of the ideas that have been around for a long time. How do we engage better with local partners? How do we give them choice and dignity and the money to actually do the work that we sometimes have done? How do we make sure that we make choices? We will not be able to do it all, and it will be incredibly painful to say no to children anywhere, but we will have to do it in order to do better for the ones that we that we do have to prioritize. We will have to tap in even more into philanthropic and public-private partnerships. There is still an incredible amount of wealth, private wealth, sitting not just in the United States, although it's big, but everywhere across the world. And we are not seeing enough of that wealth make it to the issues that we care about, not just through taxpayer dollars, but also through philanthropic efforts. So how do we engage more with those people to, yes, fund us, fund the issues that we care about, fund issues in their country that they care about. And I think we are positioned to do that well. We have invested behind, Lucy knows as well, behind our private philanthropy and partnership team. We have invested behind our brand. We have invested behind evidence, and Sylvia is going to talk about that, because that is also incredibly important to actually make sure that we're getting those philanthropic dollars into the issues that we care about. So that was 20. So, sort of our outlook for 24, lots of trends to look at. The team literally in the next room here is discussing which are the ones that we're going to prioritize, which are the ones that we really want to major on. So I'm looking forward to hear their views. Then maybe lastly, a little bit about my trip to Egypt and the West Bank and Rafah, the crossing. I spent some time in Ramallah with our team there in OPT. We have about 70 people in total in the Palestine territories. 23 of those are in Gaza, who I spoke to this morning, and the others are on the West Bank. Of course, huge trauma in the team, as you can imagine. Everybody has lost somebody and something, and usually multiple somebodies and things. We have lost our own staff member there with his young family, as many of you will know. So these are tough conversations. The level of trauma is extraordinary. I spent 3 hours on Sunday listening to Gazans who made it out with their family into Cairo. And their stories, and a lot of those have been, published widely, not just by us, but by many other organizations. Stories about using birdcage wire to suture bones, because there are no medical supplies, there is no food, there is no water, there is no safe place in Gaza currently. And then, of course, we've got increasing violence on the West Bank, and I saw that firsthand as well. When I was there, there was violence erupting also in Ramallah and Hebron. I made it to Egypt. We had the chance to not only speak to staff, but also to the UN colleagues, US AID mission in Jerusalem, in Cairo, the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. The deputy administrator for Samantha Power was actually in town in Jerusalem, so I had a chance to connect with him and really talk about how we're working together to ensure that some of these messages are getting through and what we're asking for. And then I was lucky enough to make it with the UN convoy to Al Arish in Egypt, where there is that infamous warehouse of the Egyptian Red Crescent, and then to the Rafah crossing, where trucks are trying to make it in. It was an extraordinary trip. What has become even more clear to me, aside from the horrific stories, is that it is still unbelievably difficult, challenging to get aid into Gaza, and even more challenging when trucks do make it in to actually deliver to the last mile, or arguably to the last 100 yards, because the situation there is still unsafe. There's rubble everywhere, there are people everywhere, so your trucks literally cannot move where you want them to move, or do so safely. Health issues, aside from looming famine, we see children, hepatitis A, B, and C, respiratory diseases, acute watery diarrhea. There is one shower for every 700 people. People stand in line for hours to get a bread. They're using animal fodder to make bread because there is no flour. The list goes on. So, I was there also to talk to our team to understand, what are we doing? Can we surge people in? Is our pipeline of stuff from hygiene kits to water, to medicine, to to diapers. What are we doing to make sure that our pipeline is set up so once access improves at some point, we are ready to surge in. Whilst in the meantime, we have to accept that everything we do is hard, it's compromised, and it's never going to be enough. But we have to continue to try. So maybe let me just stop there and see if there's any questions.
Well, I'm going to kick off the first question because I was told I'm allowed to go a little rogue. So just beware.
Of course you do.
I know this is sensitive. So I follow Save's Insta. If everybody here should follow Save's
I'm glad.
Instagram. Yeah. Because it's, you see what we're putting out there, and sort of what we're trying to communicate about ourselves as a humanitarian organization. I think we do a good job, but early in the Gaza crisis, we got highly criticized for not coming out and taking a firm stand. And, on sort of the issues that led up to the crisis and even, sort of the action as a result. As a humanitarian organization, should we be taking a stand, or, how do we sort of dispel the notion that we should be?
I think as a humanitarian organization, or at least that's the choice we have made, and with us, I think a number of other humanitarian organizations, we take a stand for children. We take a stand for children in Gaza, in Israel, children who were taken hostage, as well as children who are now being essentially bombarded indiscriminately. And that's the stand we take. We do not call out individual players, and we really, really try to stay away from it. The other thing I would say, this is such an unbelievably difficult conflict, as I'm sure you've all seen. I've also said from the get-go to our own staff here in the US, but also globally. And of course, there's many different opinions about this conflict and have been for arguably thousands of years. Let's not pretend that we're going to get every single tweet, every single Instagram reel, every single statement. It's not going to be perfect. There's always going to be somebody, in this case, when you're trying to be impartial and independent, there's always somebody who's going to be mad at you. And so it has proven to be, right? Because we get it from both sides. And that's okay. And sometimes we have to accept that we came out too soon with something. We jumped too soon. And then we can adjust, but still try to hold the line that it is unacceptable to see this kind of collective punishment of a population of 2 million people, 1 million children, who essentially have nowhere to go.
Thank you. I mean, I'm reminded always of, I want a bumper sticker that just every war is a war against children.
Indeed.
Right? I mean, that's sort of, I find myself, sort of defending, the fact that we're not, sort of siding with one side, because there is no side, as we know.
There's no side here, and there are certainly no winners in this particular war.
Absolutely. And, we're a humanitarian organization, not a political organization. So, and children can't vote. So we're protecting their rights. So I love our mission, and that's why I'm here. So thank you for underscoring that. I think it's really important to get that out. Any other questions or comments for Yanti?
I just wanted to say, I'm really glad you went, Yanti. It makes a big difference that you show up and you see what's happening firsthand, because it's a long way to go. It's complicated, and I hear you're going back pretty soon as well.
Yeah, that's the idea. I really, really wanted to go in this time. It was deemed unsafe, and we weren't ready enough to to have the safety and security there in place. And then it would be a distraction. And that's the last thing I want to do. Our search team actually went in on Wednesday, and of course, I wanted them to be the focal point for the team there, to make sure that they can, we started to hire 100 community volunteers in Gaza to help scale up our response, and at the same time, actually provide employment for people in Gaza to be, purposefully helpful instead of being victims. So that to us is to me is much more important to have that done. But I'm hopeful that I can actually go back and get in a couple of weeks' time, because it is important. I was talking to the team there this morning, and I felt guilty for not being able to go in, and I sort of felt like I failed them, but they were so happy to know that I was so close. I was literally a kilometer away from where our guest house and our office now is in the south of Gaza, in Rafah, and I think they did feel that, and knowing that I'm coming back, and that there is a real ear for their issues, no matter how sort of harrowing their stories are, and they are. But I think for them to feel that we are there and listening to them, I do think in some small way helps.
Yeah, I really think that when we go and we meet people, and this year we went to Ukraine, we went to South Sudan, you mentioned we went to Sierra Leone. When we get out there and meet people, first of all, it helps us in the mission and telling the story, but it also, I mean, definitely in Juba, I mean, we were there, and it was great meeting people, and they were super excited to meet us, and prepared for it for weeks, and kept saying right up until the day we came, do you think they're really going to come? So but it does make a difference to show up.
It does. It makes a huge difference. Exactly. And thank you all for doing that, right? Those trips are those trips are not easy. But they are very special.
Yeah.
Well, just the second most dangerous country in the world. I want to go to the most dangerous country in the world. I will not have failed. Like I've lived until then. But Yanti, to brag for a moment, I mean, as a direct result of your recent visit, we have some aid flowing again. Yes.
We do have some aid flowing again, and we're pushing so hard. But let's not mistake it, right? It's just in terms of this statistic, and it was striking again. I knew the numbers, but when you're there in that warehouse in a region, you see literally hundreds of trucks everywhere parked, waiting for approvals to come in. We're seeing on an average about 125 to 150 trucks go in. Before the conflict, we knew it was 500 plus going in. So it is woefully inadequate. I think it takes trucks 5 to 6 off and onloads in order to get in. And then the really hard part starts of how do you get it from the south, the crossing, to all of these other, to the shelters, to the homes, to the hospitals, to the schools, where we need the supplies to be, and to do so safely. So, that logistical, it is a tremendously, yes, it is a political challenge. It's also a tremendous logistical challenge.
How are we doing on fundraising? Do we have any?
Actually, not too bad. I mean, I was heartened. So our appeal for this crisis is $70 million for the next 12 months, which I think is good. It's ambitious. It's again, is it enough for everything? No, but it is ambitious. We are at, I think, between $30 to $35 million secured. So that's good. That's good at this stage. I would argue better than most. And it's, it is still largely driven by the US. Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance have come in properly, and I think there's more to come if Congress will land a supplemental deal. Then there is definitely more money to come. Other donors, I think, are still waiting until access is possible, which of course is a little bit of a chicken and an egg. But I am confident that we can actually, as long as we can make sure we scale up the response well and with quality, we will be able, I think, we should be able to get to that target, because otherwise it's unbecoming of Save the Children not to do so. So I think we feel good. In the US, I think overall we managed to raise something of $20 million. And a large part of that, surprisingly, was actually the private sector. So companies, private sector companies, as well, of course, as philanthropists and mass market people. So I think we've done well. Actually, we've done well. Lucy's team, Jen's team, we've been out there, with content, with media, with outreach, with our amazing relationships, and I think we've we've shaken those trees, and we're going to need to do a lot more.
Right.
Yanti, what are our plans for Ukraine this year? Like when we look at Ukraine,
Yeah, exactly.
sort of like the burning issue last year. Now, the war has become normalized, and sort of the
Yeah.
every existence of Ukrainian is, yes, a bomb might fall. How are we looking
Look, it's
at Ukraine
a
in
totally
terms
point. I
of-
mean, the point of reminder was literally yesterday when we got news that our office in Kharkiv was hit by shelling. Now, as Peg will know, because she's the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee in SCI, good preparation and professional processes help, because our office was protected because we had at least made some risk mitigation. We protected the glass. We put sandbags on the floor, etc. So nobody was hurt. Yes, there was a little bit of material damage, but nothing that can't be fixed. But again, a reminder of this war is not over by any long shot. One of our staff got killed a couple of weeks ago, not in a Save the Children office, but because she was at a funeral for somebody else, and then there was shelling during that event. Look, Peg and I and Deborah and Brad went there in September, and I thought that was going to be the topic that I was going to talk about, that we were going to talk about, etc. And then, of course, we haven't. But we are in I'm very proud of the work that we do in Ukraine. I think we've got an A-star team in Ukraine. One of our best leaders is the country director in Ukraine. We do all the work that we do in emergencies. And as I said, we do the work that is long-term child protection and education, from remedial teaching, catch-up clubs, mental health and psychosocial support for Ukrainian kids and teachers, I think is unbelievable. We have money for it. We do have good US government funding, as well as private funding, flexible funding available. Ukraine in that sense is, arguably all the other countries in Save the Children would say Ukraine is really well endowed compared to everybody else. But of course, more will be needed. So we're going to continue to push that. And that's also why we are very active in DC with other organizations, of course, and allies on the Hill to push for this humanitarian supplemental to be agreed, because that is holding up literally the cash flowing into both Ukraine and issues like Gaza. I spoke to the leader of the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance in Jerusalem, and she said, I've never been in a position where I have no money. I might even not get paid next week myself. There is no money because that dysfunctionality is still there. But we are assuming that there will be a solution there ultimately. So that's how we're trying to tie the things together from an advocacy point of view, as well as from a funding point of view. But so that was a long-winded answer to say, Ukraine, we've got ambitious plans. I think we've got the A-team there. But we this is a long game.
Yanti, back to your point about preparedness, you kind of spurred a question. Obviously, as a humanitarian organization, you're no stranger to conflict, war, natural disaster, but has the conflict, going back to Gaza briefly, in Israel and Gaza, informed any of your readiness or preparedness plans, just kind of given the unprecedented nature of the conflict?
I think it's a great question, Elsa. And I think really, because I was really struck by it after my trip, and I essentially wrote up some recommendations also for our colleagues, our global colleagues who are overseeing the direct operational work. We do emergency preparedness in all countries, right? There's standard training. We do the simulations. What will happen if something big happens? And then we need to test our processes and responses. And that is good. And, that level of work needs to happen. But to see it in action, and we saw a little bit of it in Ukraine at the time when it really kicked off, and we're seeing it in Gaza. If your own team is so much affected that they become also really part of the vulnerable population, aside from being also the responders, right? That is almost a different level of preparedness that you need to have. So, and I said to my global colleagues, I'm not sure yet we're doing yet enough for our colleagues in Gaza or on the West Bank, for that matter. Now, yes, it is hard, right? We're not going to take them out. We can't go in and give them everything. We can't promise them security, but what are we doing to make sure that we're helping them, not just financially, but also in terms of mental health and psychosocial support? So I think there are opportunities there that we haven't fully addressed yet, because sometimes in the humanitarian space, people instantly go for, okay, so what do we need to? Yes, we need to buy stuff. Yes, we need to get access. Yes, we need to advocate. But in this case, we also really need to take care of the people, our colleagues there, because otherwise they can't be helpful, right? It's that classic, in case of an emergency, make sure you put your oxygen mask on first before you help somebody else.
This is Susan. I just wanted to remark that I'm incredibly impressed that SAVE is able to basically differentiate, wear multiple hats. I mean, if from the outside looking in, if I wasn't already aware, I would think of SAVE primarily as an emergency organization, because there's an emergency every day, and theoretically, right? And your appeals often garner the most income, the most donations when there is an emergency. That's human nature. But in the background, I mean, what you said earlier was really very impressive, is your commitment to staying in the region and building these other programs once the conflict has abated or minimalized, so that you're at least able to do that. And so I'm very impressed with that. I'm not always sure that message gets out, but it is so important, because those issues don't go away just because the conflict ends, as you know better than I do. And I do have the pleasure, I'll say, to go to Sierra Leone next week with Mary for the early child marriage program, ending child marriage program, which is one of those programs that is not an emergency, but you guys have been working on it for a very long time. And, to me, that's very impactful. So I appreciate your commitment to staying in wherever the conflict is, and even where the conflict isn't today in the front page of the New York Times, because those are the things that really are going to make change down the line. So I thank you for that. And I think we also need to continue to reinforce that in the public domain.
I 100% agree, Susan. I think, look, Jen Garner is here. I hope many of you would have seen the amazing work Jen has done for us with Cynthia McFadden fairly recently in 3 different segments of the Today Show, really drawing attention to, children in rural America. That, actually, that is an ongoing emergency, but nobody sees it in that way, and it is incredibly hard. So we have to find creative ways, and in this case, with an amazing spokesperson and driver of that, and who gets that recognition and who draws that attention to it, and all of a sudden we see that there is a little bit more attention, a little bit more awareness of those issues. So you're absolutely right. It is not just about taking sometimes the easy media highlights, even if they're there for only a short while, but also finding ways to bring attention to those other stories.
All right, great questions, and thank you for that discussion. Anya, do you want to take it over from here?
Sure. So we're going to move along a little bit, and we're going to speak with Sylvia Parusolo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Our Managing Director of Evidence for Impact at SAVE. Thank you for being with us. So I have a few questions for Sylvia to give us a basic understanding of what she does, but if you have any questions of your own, please interject. So Sylvia, let's start off by telling us about your background and how you got involved in this area.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here with such a group of inspiring women. One of the reasons why I love working for Save the Children. So briefly about myself, I'm an economist by training. I started working in this area a little more than 20 years ago in Italy, where I grew up, at the Center for Research on Healthcare and Management. And my first project was actually a research on comparing cost and effectiveness of coronary stents. So a medical science type of research, which made a lot of sense in an environment of scarce resources and a public healthcare system in Italy. You really need to look at what is most effective, but also what is the cost of comparing the effectiveness. So that was my first and very formative experience. And then I had the opportunity to go and work at the World Bank with the chief economist, who at the time was one of the biggest proponents of what started to become the gold standard of evaluations. So using randomized controlled trials for evaluating the impact of our programs in international development, which again was an incredibly formative experience. And since then, I got to work at the International Center for Research on Women at the ILO. And then as I was about to, as a working mother, say, maybe I can't work in international development anymore, I got a call from Save the Children to see if I was interested in becoming the global head of child poverty. And I landed my dream organization and possibly my dream job. I supported the development of the strategy, which is the first global strategy, really data-driven, and now something we're trying to track in the most rigorous ways, and started this job, which I'll tell you a little bit more about.
Unmute, Anya.
I just realized that, I'm sorry. So that's fantastic. What excites you most about heading evidence for impact? And the increased focus on this across globally across those buildings.
You're breaking up a bit, but what excites me most about my new role, especially, which is called Evidence for Impact, is, if you go to the next slide, please, Mary. It's really trying to use evidence to address what, sorry, yeah, I didn't know there was a animation here. That's it. Thank you. So it's really about what Yanti has painted the picture. Unfortunately, even if a lot of things are going much better than they did in terms of children's mortality rates and many other things, with COVID, climate, conflict, some of the positive trends actually reversed in the past few years, and there's more children in conflict now than ever. So children need our more, and the money, the resources we have in our hands to resolve those problems are, if not the same, possibly less. So we really need to be very, very careful about how we invest our scarce resources. We have trade-offs and choices, as Yanti said. So if you go to the next slide, I think the way evidence can really help us in amplifying our impact, so with the same amount of resources, achieve more. It's really three main pathways. The first one is having data really helps understand what are the issues that affect children and test innovations and test ways to address those issues. And another way evidence can help us increase our impact is by really, once we know have piloted solutions, how can we replicate those solutions? So how do we know what are approaches that we should be doing more and more of, and maybe some that we should stop doing because they're not as effective? And finally, evidence can really help us influence others. Obviously, we're not alone in the fight for children's rights, and we need government partners, philanthropists to really help us. And if we have the evidence of what works, that will be obviously, it's not all, unfortunately, sometimes that people want to see, but it's what will help us make the case. Next slide, please. So I often get asked, what do we mean by evidence and what do we mean by impact? Two words in my job, this job title. By evidence, we really mean factual information to use as proof to support a claim or a belief. As Abhijit Banerjee said, I'm quoting him, as you know, he's one of our trustees and a Nobel Prize, it's easy to be seduced by our own narratives. We think we know what works, and we, as a 100-year-old organization, many times we do, but we have to continue questioning our assumptions and testing and making sure we know what is, again, value for money. We don't have all the resources we need to be sure what we do has an impact. So what does impact mean? If you go to the next slide, by impact, we really mean achieving changes in well-being, in rights. It's not just the activities and the reach, how many children to reach and what we did, which is obviously very important, but it's also what happened as a result of what we're doing with our programs. And this is a very loaded definition, but it really speaks to our values as an organization. So we all obviously want to changes that realize children's rights at scale, for example, that improve equality. So we don't want some children to benefit at the expense of inequality of other children. So next slide, please. I think for us to really achieve this and uplift our focus, we're an organization that's been developing evidence that it's cited in papers and systematic reviews. So we do this already, but I think as a field, we have a challenge of wanting to collect a lot of data and sometimes ending up having too much or the wrong data or not having enough for the things we need. So we need to be more intentional developing the right evidence. And what that means is really focusing more on outcomes. As I said, definitely we're very good at tracking what we do and for who we do it and where we do it, but also making sure we know what the changes that we're seeing. In identifying areas where we have actual gaps and we want to develop rigorous evidence, and we can discuss a little bit more what that means. And then partnering with the local and global academic institutions that can help us not only develop credible evidence, but use it at local level for the local knowledge that needs to stay in the places we work, as well as globally to make it a public good and synthesize lessons across the world. And finally, I think we really need to become better at using the data we have, and not only to tell ourselves a story, a compelling story. We don't always have all the data we need, but we can pull it together from different sources to really look at impact. I think I might pause here, and I forgot to say, please do interrupt me anytime, because I want this to be a conversation. I'm using these slides just to keep me on track, as this could be a topic I would talk about for hours, obviously, and we only have a few minutes. So I can pause for a second to see.
So one of the things that has been striking me as we've been talking about impact and measuring impact is, doesn't it all start from asking the right question? I mean, you know, certainly in health stats, that's where we always start. So I'm just curious how you come up with framing the questions.
That is absolutely right. And I think it relates to the point around focusing more on outcomes. I think sometimes, and especially sometimes when we are focusing on donor compliance and just responding to what others ask us, we tend to ask ourselves, which is a very important question, did we deliver what we said we were going to deliver? Or did we do it in the right time frame? And sometimes we don't ask ourselves, as a field, I think honestly, Save the Children does this pretty well quite across the board, but really asking ourselves, what is the change that our program has caused? What is happening to children as a result of our program? Because I think it's quite common practice to track what happens to children before and after our programs. And so we see a trend. But we don't always question, is that change because of our program or because of many other things that are happening in the environments we work, which are really obviously very complex, which we need to show. But I agree with you. It all starts with, it's not about a method. It's more about the right question.
Sylvia, this is Mary. I'm wondering if you, especially as we're talking about the Ending Child Marriage Project, if you could speak a little to sort of the complexity of measuring social behavior change, as opposed to, you know, this community received X amount of X, right? Social behavior change in particular is very, it's a little more opaque when you're looking at it. So curious what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. I mean, there are things like literacy and numeracy that are, we kind of got it. We know how to measure that, even the most complex contexts. But there are other issues like norm change that we want to address through social behavior change interventions, like the one in Sierra Leone, that are much more complex to measure themselves. Like the measure of a norm change is difficult. And also, it's much more difficult to tie that social behavior change intervention, which is complex in nature, again, comparing to literacy. For literacy, we know we have some methodologies that are pretty standard. For social behavior change, usually it's a complex intervention that looks at the various levels of individual, community, the enabling environment. So you need to measure all of these different levels of interventions and understand what's the pathway to that norm change. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. It's clearly something we're still, as a community, testing, not only the intervention themselves, but what is the best way to measure it. But at Save the Children, we have actually a couple of randomized control trials trying to test different types of interventions. And simultaneously, like in the program in Sierra Leone, I think we're trying to, with qualitative, well-established methodologies, like the most significant change methodology, which is more qualitative, really understanding how the communities is perceiving and seeing the pathways of change. So I think again, great question. That is an area where it's not even just difficult to design the right intervention, but it's really quite challenging to measure the impact.
Thank you.
Sylvia, I was interested in your partnership with global academic institutions to assist you in this process. I sit on a couple advisory boards for major research institutions, and sometimes I feel they have the apparatus to do all the measurement, but it doesn't translate to change for good in the world. And then I see that we at SAVE are doing the change for good, but could really use their apparatus and their research experts to do the measurements so we don't have to recreate the wheel, and maybe we can access their resources. So do you have an example of somewhere that you've done that, or a project that you have partnered with a global academic institution?
We have quite a few, and I would love to share them all, but let me just give you a couple of examples. One is actually an ongoing intervention that we're doing in Niger for adolescent sexual reproductive health, also linked to social norm changes. And we're working with UC Davis with their expertise and their researchers to do a randomized control trial and understand if comparing two different interventions, and again, seeing which one is scalable, feasible, and applicable in the context. Similarly, we work a lot with JPA, which is an institute that came out of MIT that really focuses on experimental evaluations in international development. When we did an early child marriage intervention to evaluate an intervention in Bangladesh. And actually, that's one of my favorite evaluations, because we started the evaluation in 2008, and we're still working with these researchers and following those girls. What is it? So many, more than a decade after. Sometimes the problem is that, because, as you say, I think it's a win-win when an organization like ours partners with global academics or academics with the expertise. But because we are different organizations with different mindsets and different ways of working, finding that a perfect win-win and that perfect collaboration long term is not as easy, but it's definitely something my role is trying to focus on, to establish more of these, I think, what I call win-win situations in which we can really use their expertise in our platform to learn together.
Thank you. That's great.
That's terrific. Well, thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you so much, Yanti. I hope everyone here enjoyed our last hour, and I look forward to seeing several of you in Sierra Leone next week. So onward.
Yes.
Take care, everyone.
Have a great trip, everyone.
Yeah,
So
safe
thank you so
travels.
much for joining us. I'm really glad you're with Save the Children. We need the kind of work you're doing. And I'm really glad that you know Abhijit because he's amazing. So I hope you guys work together.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Safe travels to the
Yeah.
Sierra Leone crew. Have fun. If you see Minister Senge, say hi from me.
We will. We are going to see him, I think. So.
I love him. He's awesome. All right. Well, take
Thank you.
care, everybody. Thank you for
Thank
joining.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.